Hey guys, thanks for coming. I'm Garrett C. I'm the CEO of DV Chain, and thanks for coming to our meetup. We've got those sign-up sheets out there. If you want to leave your email address, we'll add you to an email list. I don't know what we'll send out on that email list, but we'd love to have your email if you want to leave it. If you don't want to leave it, no problem. And then also, if you don't mind, I'd kind of like to take a picture of the room, but I understand the anonymous nature of a lot of you. So if you'd like to duck your head or look away, please do so, because I'm about to take your picture. Thanks. So I guess first of all, I'd like to thank Sam Ford and John Hazrati from DV Trading who helped us organize all this. And thanks to Justin for coming. He's going to present. He has a lot of experience presenting Monero meetups and has done a lot for the community and put together a lot of really cool materials and done a lot to help the Monero community kind of become a community. I guess so. As I mentioned, I'm the CEO of DV Chain. DV Chain is a cryptocurrency market-making company, and so we make markets electronically on exchanges like GDAX and Poloniex and Bittrex and all the electronic exchanges, and we also make markets over the counter. So if you need to do a large block trade, if you want to sell $1 million worth of Monero, I hope you wouldn't want to, but if you need to, we can provide that market for you, and that way you don't have to worry about the daily withdrawal limits the exchanges have. You don't have to worry about how much you're going to push the price, or that you might sell it, and push the price down on one exchange, even though it's at a different price on another exchange. We have algos that work across multiple exchanges to make sure that we can not impact the price very much, and also have relationships with other over-the-counter parties that can help us, lay off that risk. So if you'd like to buy or sell Bitcoin, Monero, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, I don't know, there's a dozen that we trade. Feel free to send an email to info@dvchain.co, and we'd be happy to onboard you as a counterparty. And I guess just on the topic of over-the-counter, most of the flows that we've been seeing this year, or I guess, over the last several months, the buyers have been mostly hedge funds and family offices, and we've just seen a huge run-up in the number of buyers that have, been showing interest. I think there's just been, every day I get a call from a new hedge fund that is interested in getting liquidity. And then on the sell side, almost all of the sellers have been people that have gotten involved very early on and just need to diversify their risk. I don't think that there's been any hedge funds really or other speculators that feel bearish on Monero. It's just people that feel that it would be irresponsible to continue holding it. And so I guess I'd just like to talk for a second about kind of how I got into Monero and my story real quickly and how DV Chain sort of came about. I guess I first purchased Monero in 2015 as just put $100 in it like I would any other scam coin, and put it on a paper wallet and kind of forgot about it. And around middle of 2016, started thinking that I want to diversify out of some of my Bitcoin holdings. And so I started looking around to see, what other coins make sense. And I did a lot of research into first the coins that I already owned, and there just weren't a lot that had a reason for existence, and the ones that did have a reason for existence didn't seem to be legitimate. I remember, Shadow Cash was all about marketing, and Unobtainium was, I couldn't find a node to be able to send my coins to another wallet. But I found Monero, and I remember seeing I don't remember if it was a video or a podcast with Fluffy Pony, and he was explaining kind of the history of Monero and in a very matter-of-fact, kind of frank way. And it really, really just sort of changed my mind on kind of a lot of what I had heard at the time, because at the time there was a lot of FUD out there, I guess. and yeah, I guess it really resonated with me how important it is to have fungible currency, private currency, and I think until I'd kind of started looking into Monero, I didn't realize just how public other cryptocurrencies are, and so really at the time that I found Monero, the biggest flaw that I saw with it was ironically that it was cheap, because the market cap was in the single 7 figures, maybe 8 figures, and so if you wanted to move a large amount of money, like, you can't, right? It's kind of a useless currency if it's a $5 million market cap coin, and so I kind of thought, well, if this becomes, I think it's great technology, I think it's really cool, but it's useless. And so how do we make it become useful? And so my first thought was, well, the price needs to be a lot higher. But then a much higher price doesn't really help by itself. What you really need is liquidity, because if I go out and I buy the price up and shoot the price up, well, great, now I own a bunch of Monero and no one else does, and it's still not any more useful. And so how do I get more people using it so that it can be useful for everyone? And so, I guess the first thing was to get familiar with the technology. I, built the code from source and made a wallet and sent money around and got kind of familiar with it, made sure that it did what it said it did, and then started, running full nodes. So I looked at the map of the Monero nodes and found countries where there were no Monero nodes and bought VPS, virtual private servers in those countries, so that I could spin up nodes to try and bring it to countries that didn't have it. Countries like Venezuela and India and wherever, New Zealand. Not to say that those countries are similar, but just that they didn't have nodes from Monero, and so I tried to make as many as I could, and then I tried to so that brings kind of accessibility to Monero, and then also I wanted to bring awareness to Monero, so I went and had T-shirts made up, and I had stickers made up, and coffee mugs and hats and anything I could think of. And if I had all of my Monero gear on right now, I'd look really silly, because I don't think I have a piece of clothing that doesn't have, I don't think there's an article of clothing that I don't have a Monero version of. And then I also, try to support any project that has anything to do with Monero. So if, all the forum funding systems I've donated to, anyone that says hey, I put together this, this artwork, and here's my donation address, I'll send a little something to them, or anything I can to try to encourage people to be involved in the community. Again, because it's important that the Monero is distributed amongst a bunch of people, and then it's used. It doesn't do any good if a few people hold a lot of it. And so I think that people need to be buying it to use it, not buying it to speculate. And then people that if there are people that own a lot of it, they should be owning a lot of it for a reason and a way to use it and turn it over. And so I guess that brings us to the third point, which is that people need a way to get into and out of Monero, and so they need liquidity, right? And so that's why we started DB Chain, was because it's very difficult in a lot of cases for people to get Monero. If I tell every person that I meet about it and how much I love it, and then they ask me how do I buy it, and I say, well, you open this account, and then you open this account, and then you got to download this wallet, and then you're going to send it from here to here, and you're going to probably have an error message, and you're going to need to open a support ticket, and it's a very cumbersome process. And if you survive all of that, then now you're a Monero holder, hodler. And so that's why a large part of the reason that we started DB Chain, to provide that liquidity. And so again, I guess, but just to touch back on why do I put all this effort in this? Why do I care so much about Monero? What's so important about it? There's really 2 points which I mentioned, both privacy and fungibility. And so I think that when a lot of people, they hear privacy or anonymity and think bad, but I think that any kind of rational person, if they understood how non-private other blockchains are, would be shocked. And so, just as an example, just as at the simplest level, the next time that someone sends you some Ether, go to a block explorer, look at that transaction, click on the from address, and you'll see, how much Ether that person owns. And then you can click on the token balances, and you can see all the different tokens that they own, the ERC20 tokens, and how much they have of that, right? And so it's like if I say, hey, I'm going to sell you this cup of coffee, and in exchange, you're going to show me your stock portfolio. Like, it's just absurd. And that's the most basic. That's like that's doing no analysis. That's just like clicking on a block explorer. And the same thing with obviously with Bitcoin. If you go to the Bitcoin rich list, you can pick out all of those addresses and put them into something like bitnotify.com is a service where you put in a Bitcoin address and your email address, and any time that a balance changes, you'll get an email. And so you might want to do that so that you know when a big whale is sending their coins to an exchange to dump them. And so it's hard for me to see how people are comfortable with that, especially if Bitcoin is going to really get to the kind of scale that like stock trading is at, right? I don't think that the big institutions want everyone to know what their money is and what their balances are of all the different stocks that they own. And then the more basic things are I guess targeted crime against the wealthy, right? So if I spend money somewhere, and then the person that I spend it with can now see my balance, and they can hold me up and tell me to give them all my money, and then also targeted advertisements. Just anything that you wouldn't want Facebook to know about. Although maybe that's not a good example because people don't seem to care. And then so that's the privacy, some of the reasons. I mean, this doesn't even touch on all of the software that's being built to de-anonymize blockchains, right? There's companies and software that's very sophisticated and also very young, and it's only getting more and more sophisticated. And soon, it's going to be no different if you spend Bitcoin. You're effectively just tweeting out your credit card transactions. I really think that it's going to be not much different than that in the very near future. And even if it is in the near term, all those transactions are public forever, and when the software gets better in 5 years, everyone can see everything. Which is not because you have anything to hide, but because you don't want people targeting you for advertisement and crime. And then I guess the other topic is fungibility. And so important in order for money to be important. In order for money to be useful, it needs to be fungible. So, for example, if someone sells me Bitcoin and I deposit that Bitcoin at Coinbase may close my account because that Bitcoin came from a gambling site, right? And that's just that doesn't make for very good money. I shouldn't care what that person did with their dollars before they got to me or whatever currency it is. And so Monero is different than that, right? Monero is private by default and optionally transparent. So if I send Bitcoin or if I send Monero to someone, no one can see where it came from, who it went to, how much was sent. But if I want to disclose any of that information, I optionally can. So if an auditor needs to be able to verify my balances, I can. There are ways to prove what your balances are and what your transactions were, without ruining the privacy of other people that you transact with. And so that's it's a good break to get some water. So that's about all I'd like to say about kind of where I came from and why we've started DB Chain and why I'm interested in Monero. I think that 2018 is going to be the year of Monero. I'm as excited as ever. I just get more and more excited about it every day. And in 2018 we have some really exciting announcements coming up. There's the bulletproofs, which is going to reduce the transaction size by 80+%. Multi-sig wallets are going to get merged in. We're going to have more than one version of hardware wallets, mobile wallets, Kovri, which hides your IP address, and I think that there's going to be a lot more exchange adoption which is something that I'm working as hard as I can with exchanges to try to get them comfortable with it. And if anyone from an exchange happens to see this and they have a reason that they're not comfortable with it, please reach out to me. I'd like to make you comfortable. I think the biggest challenge in getting exchanges comfortable with accepting Monero is getting their compliance departments to be honest with me about what their problem is with it. And so, because I want to go out. We're talking to some law firms about putting together an opinion letter that we can give to exchanges and say, like, this can be AML compliant. And so, I guess that's the extent of what I'd like to say. Thanks again, everyone, for coming, and I'll hand it off to Justin.
I'm sorry? I'll sit over here. I'll probably stand up because I can't sit down. Especially like when I'm on the phone, I always like pace around. I have to stand up. So, hello everyone. Thanks again to Garrett and DB Chain for making this event so special. I mean, just kind of look around. I've literally never been in a nicer location for a meetup before. Usually it's like in a reserved section of a bar or something. And it's fun. I would still love to go there, but this is just something else. So really thank you for that. So I want to speak today about Monero, and I know that Garrett already spoke a little bit about why he got involved in Monero and what he finds exciting, but in my opinion, Monero is really safe money for everyone. It has all of the same properties of money that you would really want to find in money, and it just takes those to the cryptocurrency space. You would be surprised to see how many cryptocurrencies among the list on CoinMarketCap either don't work or can't be used, or if you use them, you're revealing all the information about yourself. And although people are typically comfortable sharing some things about what they do, a lot of people start drawing the line when everyone knows what they make and details like that. So that's something that Monero would like to help protect when we build the next digital system so that you can use cash in the future, except on the blockchain. And we think that Monero is really good for that. So the reason Monero is so interesting is because it takes the same trustless system of Bitcoin and it just adds privacy and fungibility on top of that. Garrett already spoke a little bit about that. But Bitcoin doesn't have either privacy or fungibility. It has security. You know that if you have your funds and you keep track of your own funds, that they can be safe as long as people are reasonably auditing the code and so forth. But the issue is that anytime you actually use Bitcoin in any way, you're revealing a lot of information about yourself. And even if you're secure now, you need to make sure that you will also be secure until the end of time, because this is recorded forever. And that's a lot of things people don't realize when they're using cryptocurrency systems. So that's why I stumbled into Monero, is because I think these are critically important systems and aspects to have of money in general. And so I think that Monero is just really good money. It's digital, it's efficient, and it has a lot of the properties people expect money to have. So just to speak about who I am real briefly, my name is Justin Ehrenhofer. I'm known online on Reddit as Samsung Galaxy Player. No, I'm not sponsored by Samsung or anything. I don't have a Samsung. But I am mostly involved in the community aspect of Monero. I've been involved for the past 2.5 years. I do not know how to code. I took a semester of Visual Basic this past semester, but that doesn't really count for anything. In fact, everyone I spoke to in Monero told me, okay, go out of your way to forget everything you learned in all of your classes so that when you want to learn an actual language like C++ or C or Python, that you can like start fresh. So I would like to do that, but at the moment, I don't really know anything. And this past semester, when I was studying abroad in spring, I had a lot of time, and I thought, okay, should I take all the effort to learn how to code right now, and I would be literally the worst person in the entire Monero community at coding, or should I just go speak to people about it? And so that's kind of what I started doing. I just went around Europe, I spoke about Monero, I crowdfunded through the form funding system, and I spoke about Monero because that's something I really like to do. And so I spoke over 20 times in Europe about Monero. I spoke several times this past year, and I'm speaking now about Monero, and I really enjoy it. I wrote a response to a research paper in the upper left-hand corner there because I felt that it kind of didn't get grasp the whole impact of how Monero actually worked. I started Monero Coffee Chat initiatives, which are monthly live stream events. We have the next one this Saturday, so I highly encourage you to go on Monero Community, keep an eye out for that and just watch. If not, if you can't catch it live, you can always catch it in the future. I'm a recognized contributor of the Monero team, and I'm also the leader of the Monero community work group. So again, I'm not really on the development side, but what I've mostly been doing these past several years is taking what the developers and what the researchers have been doing and translating it so that people can understand and get involved in that. That's kind of what I've been doing. So I'm at the University of Minnesota. I'm studying finance and management information systems, and I'm a junior. So that's kind of, the background about me, I guess. But I feel that Monero is really important. I don't just spend time in Monero. I have a cryptocurrency club at the University of Minnesota with 300 members, and we speak about everything. But I make sure that we talk about Monero because I feel it's really important, and I feel it's one of the few projects in the space that actually has a functional product for something that actually has a need. And so that's why I like to talk about it. So let's talk a little bit first about Bitcoin. So if a lot of this stuff was passed over your head, it's fine. Let's start with a quick intro. So Bitcoin is decentralized. So instead of you sending money directly to someone, or you're using PayPal or Venmo to send someone money, you instead rely on thousands of computers around the world to record the transaction and thousands of additional other computers to actually verify that transaction. And so there's no single point of failure, like if Venmo servers went down or something. You would still be able to send transactions because there are thousands of people that are contributing to this network. So it's pretty darn secure. And with Bitcoin, you have a lot of transactions. So if I send you money, it's kind of similar to how you actually send cash. So if I just gave you 20 bucks, like I'd take out my wallet, I'd give you $20. With Bitcoin, it actually kind of works the same way, except it's digitally. I just cryptographically assign the rights to the $20 output to you. And of course, it's in Bitcoin, but that's basically how it works. And this is recorded in the form of transaction. And these transactions are bundled into blocks. These blocks just contain these transactions. And every 10 minutes on average for Bitcoin, there's a new block. And so collectively, these blocks form the blockchain, which stores all the transactions that have ever happened. So it's pretty simple. You can see, okay, this money, who owns it right now? And it'll say, okay, this address owned it. In the past, these addresses owned it. So it's pretty simple. That's how Bitcoin works. With Monero, it's pretty similar, actually. You still send money in a similar way. But instead of people actually knowing the information on the blockchain, it's obfuscated. You can't really do anything with it. And I'll take the time today to explain why that's actually the case. So with Bitcoin, again, you have like two people, Bob and Alice is the example we always use with cryptography. Suppose that one person was sending another person 0.1 Bitcoin. So instead of their names there, they're just random hashes. These are addresses. And you just send from one address to the next. So you can see Bob has 4 outputs over there. Those are the green boxes. And let's just have Bob give one of those to Alice. So pretty similar. It's pretty simple. It's just like if you took money out of your wallet and just gave someone a single bill. That's how it works, except instead of a set denomination, they're just different denominations of Bitcoin contained in these blocks. That's how it typically works. That's how it works. The problem, though, is that Bitcoin is not anonymous. You can actually trace every transaction for the history of time through this method. And this is a company whose entire purpose is to make sense of this data. It's called Elliptic. And this is a visualization they have on their website showing how money has been sent between different addresses. And since this is all public information and it's also permanent, as these systems get better and better, it'll be harder for you to have simple tactics like just reusing or using different addresses because there's still a physical link between these on the blockchain. So it's really hard to give yourself privacy if you're dealing in a system that is completely transparent by nature. It's really difficult. And I argue that for a significant number of people in this network, it's basically impossible. So that's something I would like to argue. So I sometimes fill this slide, but I actually wanted to just make this a little bit more of a discussion setting. So could someone just raise their hand and tell me, why do they think that privacy matters? Why should I care about privacy at all? Okay, any participants? Yes?
You wouldn't want other people, your colleagues, to know what your salary is or how much you're getting paid.
Right, so even if you don't want you suppose you're going out for lunch and you're trying to split the bill and your friend's like, hey, you make more than me, that kind of get annoying. Or even another practical example, suppose you're negotiating rent with your landlord. It's probably not the best if they know how much you make. So that's an important reason to have privacy. Someone else? Yes?
It's an
Okay, so you believe that it's a right that you have, even if there's no practical reason, you're entitled to your privacy, and so you should be able to have that and use whatever tool necessary in order to maintain it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Someone else? Yes.
First, last one that he said, regardless of what the reasons are, that's something we should have. But then you get targeted with advertisements for no good reason.
Yep, targeted advertising is important as ad agencies get larger. Some people like personalized ads, but there should be a way to opt out of them or a way for you to protect yourself if you don't want them to collect data on you. Someone else? How about one related to fungibility? So like, why does privacy matter in the context of fungibility? Yeah?
Because with cash, if we use cash, we can make a transaction no one knows. So if we use crypto, we should be able to do the same thing.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting how we're kind of taking a step backwards in privacy. We're getting more technologically advanced, and then we're kind of, with most of these cryptocurrency systems, taking a step back. So Monero kind of adds this that people are already familiar with and might take for granted when they're using Bitcoin because they assume that it works like cash, but it really doesn't. Anyone else? Yeah?
To go sort of with Garrett's example, if I'm just being if I'm not fully due diligent on who I'm buying it from, I can be penalized for nothing but ignorance.
Right, so that's actually really important. Think about this as a crazy example. Suppose that I have money and I wanted to donate some Bitcoin to you. There might be an economic incentive for you to say, no, I will not take this money. Why? Because you might not want to be connected with the money that I'm giving you. You need to audit, if there's no fungibility in a system, you need to audit all of the funds you are receiving to make sure they aren't tainted. That's pretty hard, and most people don't do that. The exchanges already are doing that. I spoke with an exchange when I was in Sweden, and they say they use a tool to track the funds that are coming in to make sure they're not tainted. So that's kind of crazy that you would need to go through this sort of effort to just accept money. Many of you may be familiar with the WannaCry attack. If someone just tried to give me like 100 Bitcoin from the WannaCry attack, I wouldn't take it. I mean, it's free money. Like theoretically, you should always take free money, but you won't because everyone in the world would know that that's connected to WannaCry, and then all of a sudden you're going to have a hard time with the feds. So that sucks. And so privacy is really important, even if you don't, it's important for a lot of principled reasons, but even if you do not buy into those, it's still important for just a simplicity and like actually making money function properly type reason. So that's really important. I wanted to highlight those. Did you have a question?
I was just saying, the Charlie Shrimp example, 2 years in prison.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to move on now towards what people started doing about it. People kind of originally thought Bitcoin was private enough because you don't have my social security number on there. You just have a random address, and since you can make an address at any time, what's the problem? But since you have all this temporal analysis, it really doesn't work out. So people were like, okay, let's try adding tools on top of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's pretty great, in order to make it work. The problem is this doesn't really work out so well. They started using something you may be referring to, like a mixer, coin join, like a blender, where several people just take their money, they send it to a centralized service. The centralized service mixes up whose is whose and gives a fraction each to every person. And so theoretically, you have some level of unlinkability here because you don't know what money was given to each person. And so, sure, it could theoretically be an improvement, but there are several fundamental issues with this sort of approach. So first, you need to opt in and pay additional money to actually use the service. So typical people that are ignorant of it are not going to use this service, and people who have freshly mined Bitcoins with no past history are not going to pay extra for this sort of benefit because they know that they don't need it. The only people, or typically, the vast majority of people that use this system are those that are trying to launder money or something. So what you're actually doing is just painting a target on your back for actually using these systems. So you have an instance with mixers where a lot of money going into it is nefarious or illegal money. And so you don't really want to be associated with that. Actually, if you're doing nothing wrong, you're still making it seem a little sketchy by having to use the service, which isn't necessarily right for it to seem sketchy, but that's just the reality of the situation. Second, this is a trusted system. I spoke about how with Bitcoin, it's trustless. You don't need to trust anyone for your privacy. It would be for your, not privacy, for your security. That would be like saying with Bitcoin, okay, yeah, I have my private key. Let me just have to give that to someone to make sure that they keep it safe. No, I mean, it's up to you to keep it safe. So why would you have to trust someone else with it? With privacy, it kind of works the same exact way, where if you use a Bitcoin mixer, you're trusting that the mixer is actually keeping your, like, holding up their end of the deal and keeping everything private. Because they have a complete, they have an omniscient view of this process, and if they keep logs, which you can't audit whether or not they keep logs or not, there's no way for you to tell, they can actually keep track of how this money is spent. And so it might be private to some people, and you might think it's private, but it's actually not. And so even if you go through the process of trying to chain multiple of these sessions, you still have trust in the system. And trust is not good for security and privacy. And then finally, just from a practicality standpoint, this is really slow. It takes forever. So if you need to opt in, you need to like volunteer and find other volunteers. And so if you're trying to mix a good amount of money, this can take several hours, days, even weeks if you're trying to do a large amount, and several rounds. This is an issue that some coins face. So as a result, you can kind of not be surprised why no one actually really uses this, because it kind of sucks. So Monero is very different. Instead of adding a layer on top of the protocol to like make some optional privacy thing, the privacy is directly baked into the entire protocol. Like no matter what you're doing on Monero, on the blockchain, everything is always private. If you want to do certain things to reveal information off the blockchain, that's your prerogative and you can still do that, but you don't want every attacker around the world just to peek in and see everything. You want to manage, you have full management control over how you reveal information. So see how it's a completely different approach. And so Monero protects all of the information on the blockchain, and it's working on additional tools to protect how you interact with the network. And I'll just walk through how these work today. So first, the sender is protected with ring signatures. The amount is hidden with ring confidential transactions, or ring CT. Monero is working on a project called Covry to hide the transaction broadcast. This is like an I2P router. I'll speak about that later. And then finally, the receiver is hidden with stealth addresses. So as you can see, throughout the whole scope of everything that happens, Monero protects everything on the blockchain and is working to better protect you on the network. Of course, you can still take network protections yourself manually, but it'll make it easier for most people, which is what we want. So let's first jump right into ring signatures and ring confidential transactions. So I want you to first think of all of the US dollar money supply. Just all of it. Imagine it was all in this room. And these, as you know, are divided into certain denominations. $20 bills, $50 bills, $10 bills, etc. With Monero, it's basically the same thing. On the blockchain, you have this ledger with all of the outputs that exist, and collectively they form the entire money supply of Monero. Suppose that this red one here is one that you have. It's as if you had it physically in your wallet, like a $20 bill in your wallet. You have the right to spend this money, and no one else does. When you use Monero, we want to hide what source of funds is being used in the transaction. Because if you did not hide this information, then you could blacklist coins. Be like, hey, this money was previously used for XYZ, or this money was used to support this political candidate, so I'm just not going to accept it. That's not necessarily ideal, and it takes a lot of work if everyone has to do that with how they accept money. So with Monero, you take other people's money on the blockchain. You don't have control over this money. You don't need their permission to make it seem, and you don't need their permission, but you make it seem as if you're spending these people's money too. So I selected 5 in blue there. Hopefully you can see. These are this is like other money that was previously spent in other transactions, and you're going to make it seem as this money is one of the source of funds that could be used. So you can see here there are 6 highlighted, either red or blue. These are 6 possibilities that all appear to be likely spent in the transaction, but there's no way of actually knowing. That's the ring signature. So again, we start with yours. Your wallet software will select the other decoys. This is all behind the scenes, so you don't need to worry about any of this. It just does it for you in a fraction of a second. And as you can see, we know that one's highlighted red, but an outside observer would not know that this one's highlighted red. They would all appear basically the same, and they would not be able to prove one of them was the one that was actually spent. In this example, we used a ring size of 6, so this means there's 6 total inputs. There's 5 that you selected from the blockchain. Currently, there is a network minimum mandated ring size of 5. So if you try to send something lower, the network will just completely reject it. And we highly encourage people to actually use that value. I'll speak to it later if that's a later question or if you want to speak with me later. Now, one question that we have is if you have the ability to make it seem like you're spending other people's money, what prevents you from actually spending other people's money? Because that would be pretty bad, right? And that's where the key image comes in. The key image is like a hash of the one input you do control, so of the red one. The blue ones are completely irrelevant when calculating the key image. And it is used by the network to verify just two things. One, that it hasn't seen this before, so you're not trying to double spend. And two, that it actually is a reference to your real input. So you're not giving it a random number. So you can go from the input, to the key image, but you can't go the other way around. So with the given key image, you don't know which input is the real one, and that's why this is super important. So this is how the ring signature looked up until the beginning of last year. But the problem was, you did know the value of each of these inputs. You would know, okay, the first one was 1 XMR, the second one was half of Monero, and this might not seem like an issue, but it's actually a big problem. Because if someone quickly sends like the same amount of money in short succession, or a really specific amount, even long in time in the future, you can kind of trace how the amounts are being spent. And say, it's kind of unlikely that someone would spend exactly 223.65324 Monero multiple times, right? So that's why it kind of sucked. So Monero implemented something called ring confidential transactions so that this information was no longer visible. So instead of using the entire input, you just cryptographically commit to spending a certain proportion of the input without revealing to the rest of the network what that value is. And so they can verify that you're spending an amount that you are allowed to, but they don't actually know what that amount is anymore. And so that's really important. You can see here in this example, I use like about half of each of these inputs. And you come up with this Peterson commitment. This Peterson commitment, there's like some math there, but it really consists of two parts. The first one is the actual amount. So if you're sending someone 1 Monero, that's your actual. Previously that was known, but we want to hide that information to better protect privacy. So we add this random number to it. Suppose 273. So you just tell the network, okay, my ring signature key, my ring signature proof is 274. You just add them together. And based off very cryptographic range proofs, you can prove that it's within certain bounds and that someone's not trying to print money out of thin air. And as such, you can make the commitment for both the series of inputs and the outputs to make sure that the money is like equal, and therefore it's still secure that way. So the Peterson commitment is critically important at hiding the amount. If you want to learn more, look at confidential transactions for Bitcoin, because it was originally developed for Bitcoin, or look specifically at Monero's implementation on Ring CT. So we're almost done with this slide, I promise. So all of this gets together for the Ring CT ring signature, which signs all this stuff together. Again, you start with your input, you select others, you make a Peterson commitment, and then you tell the rest of the network. And then that results in an unknown amount of Monero being sent. So this is like the ring signature and ring CT part. And then finally, you also have this commitment public key, which you give to the network to prove that you did this Peterson commitment stuff correctly. Okay, any questions real quick on this ring signature portion? So in a general sense, I want to make sure everyone understands that Monero hides what source of funds is being used because it takes your money and it takes several other people's money, and it makes it seem as if they're all simultaneously spent, and so you don't know which one actually is. That's the ring signature for you. Okay, any questions? Yeah?
So Monero does the hiding and the shuffling, so to speak, but I've heard of certain coins like Zcoin that actually destroys the transaction. And correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah.
they claim that they have superior.
Yeah. I'll speak more about, I typically don't focus on Zcoin because it uses the zero coin protocol instead of the zero cash protocol. They're slightly different, but I can talk more about that later in a comparison section. But they have a completely different way. They do not use this method at all. So you can kind of table that thought for later, and then we can just compare the advantages and disadvantages. Yeah?
This may be a somewhat technical or suggestion. When it does, in your example, a ring size of 6, is it always 1 or always 2 or always 4 real transactions? Or does it just randomly choose
So for each of the inputs, it will select. So typically, if you're sending a standard transaction on the Monero network, the ring size would be 5. So you would select 4 other fake decoy inputs in that transaction.
Every time.
Well, you could have multiple inputs, and then you would select additional decoys. So for each input, you would have different decoys. Yep. Yeah.
This is a really newbie question, but like, can you increase that like dramatically?
Yeah. So.
But then you pay more of a transaction fee for doing that?
So if you can increase this theoretically pretty much any as long as the number is equal to or less than the total number of inputs on the Monero blockchain, you could theoretically do that. It takes much more computation time in order to actually verify the transaction, and it is a little bit larger. It's less of a gap compared to earlier, like in 2016 and earlier Monero, but it's still larger. We highly encourage to use the standard ring size of 5, because if you have a weird ring size, your transaction stands out because people can see the weird ring size. And if I send 30 transactions with the ring size 37, which no one else on the network is doing, I kind of create links between my transactions. So that's not ideal. If you need, for some reason, to dilute funds or like add additional entropy, send multiple transactions. That's what you should do with the standard ring size of 5. Yeah?
Do I understand correctly that key image can be used to prove that I actually sent someone's money? Like, I know that the whole transaction is hidden. Let's say that I sent Anton some Monero, and he says I didn't receive it. So is there a way for me to, without revealing obviously private?
Yes, so we can cover that later. Several block explorers have an option to prove you send a transaction. Typically, though, with that, you would use the transaction ID, so like the transaction ID known to the network. You would use the TX private key, which is stored in your specific wallet, and you would use the recipient's address, and then it would say, yes, money was sent. It would be completely different than the key image. It's some other thing you can use for that. Yep.
With the ring size of 6, if I sent a really large amount of Monero and all the other transactions were really tiny, couldn't you still say, oh, well, this guy sent 500 and the rest were half? So obviously, on the other end, when he got the lion's share, it must be from this original address.
Yeah, so the good thing is that the amount is completely hidden now. So you can it's completely dependent on the number of inputs, and these are not, they might be very loosely correlated to the total amount, but they can contain any value. So I could send you a transaction with 20 inputs, and each of those inputs has 0.1 Monero in them, and so they're pretty small. Or I can send you a transaction with 1 input that just contains 20,000 Monero, and so there's no way to know how much is sent in these inputs, so that's not a big concern. Well, so you can tell the difference between transactions that have many inputs and those with 1 input, but you don't know the amounts in either of those cases. So if someone's dealing in a small amount, it's typically like a mining pool or something. Okay, so I'm going to take only one more question, and then we can always talk later too. Anyone have any questions? Wow, okay, well then I can move on. Perfect. So that's the complicated part, okay? You're already past the hard part. So let's kind of take a look at how these inputs kind of have a life over time in the blockchain, because it's very different for Bitcoin and Monero. So let's take the same inputs as before. Again, suppose you have your 8, the same input here. And we have like a theoretical blockchain history on the right. And where the blocks are highlighted red, that's where this input appeared in one of the transactions. So with Bitcoin, this is really easy. If it appears, it's spent. The end. Right? So in this example, you would know it's sent from wallet A to B, wallet B to C, wallet C to D. Very, very simple. With Monero, there's several situations where it would be included in a block. Either it's a coin-based transaction, so it's new mint money that's generated, in which case everyone would know that it's new money. There's a second case, such that I'm actually spending money, and so it needs to be included in the blockchain, just like Bitcoin. But importantly, the third case could be someone else uses my money as a decoy in their ring signature for their transaction. And since there is no way for an outside observer to determine the difference between the second and third cases, people don't know even though your input appears in the blockchain, they don't know it's spent. And so that's critically important. That way, people can't try and blacklist funds based on how inputs are used. That's really important. So that's kind of a more broader level there. So let's talk a second about Kovri. I think Kovri is super fun because I learned about Tor, I2P, Freenet, etc. before I even knew about Bitcoin, and that's kind of what caused me to get into Monero relatively early, is because I thought these systems were pretty cool. So people understand that, okay, now the blockchain is transparent, let's make it not so you don't see everything, but they forget about what is required to get your transaction actually in the blockchain. When you send a transaction, you need to tell the rest of the network that you would like this transaction to actually be included in the next block. And you might leak a lot of information in the process of doing that. So what does Kovri do? Kovri just creates an anonymizing layer such that when you send transactions and connect to the rest of the nodes in the network, that they don't know your IP address. They don't know several information about you. Because without Kovri, suppose I'm sending a transaction on this origin node, and I broadcast to the rest of the nodes out there, hey, this is the transaction, please include it. They might have, some of the nodes might be logging the IP address that they got these requests from. So I might send this request from my home address, and they might be, okay, I don't know for sure because it might have gone through another node first, but I think it's likely that this transaction is associated with this IP address. They don't know anything else. They don't know who you're sending it to, how much money, where the money's coming from. But they could come be like, okay, let's go knock on this guy's door and ask for their private key, which is not ideal. So Kovri is really important for that, to break the link of a lot of metadata between a lot of the transactions that you make. So instead of relaying this transaction directly through the ClearNet, Kovri uses the I2P network. How many people here are familiar with I2P? Woo, not that many. That's normal. How many people are familiar with Tor? Okay, actually not that many either. So, so when you use these networks, I'm going to be really broad here. When you use these networks, you first relay connections between other people on the network. So if I'm sending a connection money to you, I would first send the request to him, and then he says it to him, and then to you. And so none of us know who each other are, and they don't know what side of the network request transmission they are. They don't know if they're the end, the middle, or whatever else. So that's why it's important. That's why it's helpful. So Kovri will use or put by default the transaction broadcast through this anonymizing layer so that people no longer actually know the real IP. So instead, they just get this long, meaningless, disposable I2P address. So you can't prevent nodes from logging. You can't blacklist nodes that are logging because you don't know which ones are. I run several VPSs. I might not be logging, but maybe my VPS provider is. I don't know, so that's a critical point of failure you need to address too. So how do you do that? You just assume everyone on the network is logging and then make sure that they don't get any information. So that's what Kovri does. It protects the IP address that way. One thing I really like about Kovri is that it's not just for Monero. It will have a common API, and it will work with pretty much any cryptocurrency or any other project. I'm not necessarily a big fan of Dash, but imagine it's really important for you to have this protection if you have a masternode. Imagine if you knew, oh wow, my neighbor is running 10 Dash masternodes and has like 1,000 Dash in each, so they have like over $10 million. Like, that's a big deal. You don't want to just publicly reveal that information. And so it's important for the integrity of the network that they provide these sort of privacy advantages on the network layer, which people often forget about. Finally, stealth addresses. This is where Monero breaks the association between funds and the addresses that they actually result in. So with Monero, let's start off with the input. So behind on this side, you have all the ring CT information, so no one knows where the money's coming from. But let's point out where it's going to. With Bitcoin, you just directly send money to someone's address. They just directly get it, and everyone knows that address receives it. With Monero, it's a little bit different. You basically create a one-time safety deposit box. You put the money in there, and then you lock it. And only the recipient can unlock this box and see what's inside. That's how stealth addresses work in the simplest sense. So a typical transaction will have two outputs. One of them will be going to the receiver. So if I'm sending you Monero, I make a transaction, I put one Monero in one of these safety deposit boxes, I lock it such that only you can unlock that box. And then one of them is actually coming back to me in most circumstances. Suppose I had 10 Monero in my wallet as one input. It's like as if I had like a $100 bill and wanted to give you $1. I basically create change with myself. I give you the $1 and I create a new bill or output with my remaining $99 in there. That's how it kind of works with the change. Just one of these outputs goes back to yourself. This is a typical transaction. You could pay several addresses. You can put several outputs. They cost more in fees and size, but it's still better than sending individual transactions to like 100 different people. It's better to make one big transaction to 100 people. But most of the time, if you're just sending money to someone, it will look like this. So that's how the stealth address works. Again, it's like you create a safety deposit box, and then the receiver needs to check to see if their key works with all the boxes. And if one of the boxes is for theirs, they can open it and have the rights to spend it. That's how that works. Okay, so just to put it all together, for a typical transaction, you have an ambiguous input where people don't know which one the real one is, that results with an unknown amount of Monero being spent, and then finally going to an unknown address. So you can see for all the information on the blockchain, it's all obfuscated for every transaction. Now, taking an even further step back, let's kind of see how this gets complicated for blockchain analysis really, really quickly. So again, same transaction there. Remember, these outputs here, even like the decoys, they previously were referenced in other transactions too. So let's have all of these outputs that are referenced to a bunch of other transactions which reference other outputs, and therefore even if you theoretically broke one of these links, you still have literally no idea what's going on for the rest of the information. And then finally, you create outputs, and these are referenced by several other transactions too. And as such, you can see how it's very, very difficult for anything here to make sense. People often say, oh, with the ring signature, there's a 1 in 5 chance that the money that's being sent is like this output. To that I say, 1, there's literally no way to prove that that's true. And 2, that even if you find out what it is, it's still a reference to nothing, because this output still has no connection to any address, and you don't know any of the previous history either, because it's still protected by several layers of ring signatures. So really these layers, this slide is meant to illustrate how the different layers work together in order to provide privacy. So one thing that's really important too is that privacy is mandatory. If it's not mandatory, no one will use it. And it's fine if you purposely want to make a transparent transaction, but the problem is that that does not provide enough privacy for those that actually need it, because you can sort which ones are private and which ones aren't, or which ones are using the privacy features and which ones aren't. Just make sure that when you're referring to privacy, don't think of it as like an absolutist value. It's like there's like a layer of a range of privacy. Some might be like a weak level of privacy that might be good for certain use cases. Others might be really strong for other use cases. And people kind of use privacy as if it's like on or off, regardless of what system you're using. And that's just not the right way to look at it. So let's just kind of see how why it's important for everything to be mandatory. Because when Monero launched, it used to not be mandatory. It used to be that you could optionally use the ring signature feature. You, of course, always use the stealth addresses, but you could reveal what the real source of the funds were, and that a lot of people did that, which is a problem. With Monero now, though, every transaction always uses these features. So it makes things really simple, that you know for certain with every transaction, regardless who you give money to, they will also protect their privacy, and so on and so forth. So as a result, all of them are private. With Dash, they have about 200,000 transactions in the past month. On their website, they say less than 1% of their transactions use the private send feature, which results in less than 2,000 transactions each month that actually use this CoinJoin privacy feature. And without even getting to whether CoinJoin works or not, that's not very good. Even if it worked, let's assume all 3 of these systems worked perfectly. The privacy was literally always perfect. That's still not very good. And then finally with Zcash, they have a good number of transactions a month, but only 10% hide either the sender or the receiver, not the amount, and less than 0.5% hide the sender, receiver, and amount, just like Monero does by default for every transaction. So you can see, if you're comparing Monero's transactions to Zcash transactions, You have 200,000 that protects the sender, receiver, and amount, and with Zcash you have 1,700. So it's very important for you to make these systems mandatory so you actually have a large anonymity set. It's not just like what's theoretically better. It's, okay, what's better in practice and what are people actually using? Okay? So, Monero has optional transparency if you want it still. Unlike with most coins where it's either global on for everyone to see or global off so that it's like private, Monero makes it such that it's always, privacy is always on the blockchain, but you can give additional resources to people off-chain so that they can make sense of this nonsense. That's done through with the view key. The view key is like a hash. The view key is it's one of the keys that you possess, and it provides some level of transparency. There's several different view keys, so it kind of makes it hard. There's one for your entire account to reveal all incoming information for the account, and also view keys to provide incoming information for certain transactions. You can give these to selected parties. Again, instead of being on or off for everyone, you choose who it goes to. So that's a much greater level of control you have over how you're discussing your funds. These are often useful for charities. They might publish the public view key if they're a nonprofit so that people can see the donations they're receiving and make sure there's like not some large corruption going on. Or perhaps even for parents just to see like when kids are spending and like keep track a little bit. Of course, with the view key you can't spend the funds. So like with the safety deposit box example, going back to the stealth addresses, they have a key to open the box, but they don't have an ability to like actually use anything in there. That's what the view key does. So a brief history of Monero. It was launched in April 2014 by someone named Thankful for Today. It was just a fair launch of the CryptoNote reference code. And this guy kind of ended up being really difficult to work with, and so the Monero core team forked the project away from this person within the first few days. It was originally also called BitMonero, but it was shortened to Monero. In September, some large attacker was able to spam the network with a very large number of transactions to force a hard fork. To our knowledge, no one lost funds because of this, but it just kind of spoke to why security is really important. Remember, the people inheriting this code had never seen it before, so it was really important that they understood what it was, and that was a really important point for really proving that. In January 2015, the really important Monero Research Lab paper 4 was released, which included certain recommendations for how Monero could improve its privacy and security. I believe actually all of these are implemented now, so that's really cool. In December, in March, all transactions were made private by mandate. You previously, again, could send a ring signature without any decoys. And then in December of 2016, Monero made a historic first step of being easier to use and published the first GUI. This is a graphical client that you can click and actually interact with. Previously, for the rest of the history, we told everyone that they could use the command line. And I don't really like that, and I imagine most people don't like that either. So luckily, we're past that. That was a real historic step going forward. It's out of beta now, so it's something that we really enjoy and reference for people to use. In 2017, Ring CT was added in January. We originally made it optional. With Monero, it was originally optional, but people implemented it much faster than it expected, so that was kind of fun. In February, on a less fun note, there was a critical vulnerability that was found, and so it was patched. When it was verified that the exploit was not used, it was an issue with the key image generation I discussed, which would be bad if it was exploited because that would allow people to spend money they don't have. It was actually exploited in some coins like Bytecoin. In April, there was another hard fork to adjust the dynamic fee and dynamic block algorithm. And then in September, there was a hard fork to make ring CT mandatory and also increase the minimum ring size to 5. It was previously 3. And so that's kind of what happened in the past. I want to first show off the GUI. The GUI was a monumental step forward at making it easier for people to use because literally no one likes when you tell them to use the command line. So this was a really important step at making Monero easier to use. This works right now. If you have an Android phone, I highly encourage you to download the Monero Android wallet. It's open source. It's excellent. It started off as functional but ugly, but now it's functional and beautiful, so it's excellent. It even allows you to pay Bitcoin addresses. So you can have Monero on there, you can scan a Bitcoin address, and it'll convert it to Bitcoin for you. So that's really cool. So you can kind of pay Bitcoin addresses with the privacy of Monero. That's something this project kind of started late 2016, and it's 2017, sorry, and it's just been excellent to see. Like, it moves so quickly into a product that everyone can use. Yeah.
Can you send Bitcoin to it?
No, you can't send Bitcoin to it. Why would you want to accept Bitcoin? Then everyone knows how much you have.
So you can anonymize it.
This is the upcoming MyMonero lightweight wallet. With Monero, there's a difference between SPV clients and lightweight clients, unlike Bitcoin. So with Monero, you can use the GUI as an SPV client. You can connect to remote nodes, but it takes more network resources than you would use SPV with Bitcoin. Lightweight wallet would use a similar amount of resources as Bitcoin's, and these are still in development. They've been in development for a long time. Most of the code is on GitHub, so you can see kind of what's happening, and you can contribute if you'd like. I have no ETA for this, but I heard from one of the announcers, just kind of keep an eye on the Monero subreddit, because they have an update from Apple soon, as far as I'm aware. And this is also upcoming. They've kind of been teasing this for a while. There's a company in Switzerland making X Wallet for iOS. So right now there's no iOS wallet that is like legitimate. We're still waiting on this to be released, but he's, like I said, been teasing it for several months, and I hope to see this in Q1 of this year. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit like what Monero is really doing in the future, because I think it's really important. Monero isn't perfect. Monero will never be perfect, and so we just need to kind of keep getting better and better. And I think that's something I really like to see in the community, is that people are really kind of growth-minded, and that's so fun to watch. Like, we don't have issues hard forking. If there's a reason to upgrade, we're going to upgrade, and that's awesome. So first, addressing transaction size. Monero transactions are large, just because, unlike a Bitcoin transaction where you can see everything, Monero basically, at the end of the day, adds a bunch of stuff to it to make it harder to keep track of. And as such, there's a lot of extra data on the blockchain. So you can see with the Bitcoin transaction of about 250 bytes, a typical Monero transaction is like 40 times larger at 13.2 kilobytes. So you can see there's a big difference there. Luckily, the code has already been done for something called bullet proofs. It's a more efficient way of doing ring CT, like I discussed earlier, which will dramatically reduce the transaction size. It will reduce the transaction size with there's like two different types of implementations. The easier one will reduce sizes by about 80%, and then a further multi-output bulletproof will reduce by a slightly like a smaller magnitude, but still a noticeable amount. And so you can see here that Monero transactions will still be larger than Bitcoin transactions, and they likely will always be larger than Bitcoin transactions, because Monero, like, the primary focus isn't efficiency. It's let's get the privacy first and then make it as efficient as possible, not like the other way around. And so as such, the transactions will be larger, and so that's why we need to look to like second layer solutions. But this will bring many benefits in addition to just a smaller size. Practical benefits for people who are just using Monero. The fees, which are tied directly to the transaction size, will also be cut by about 80 to 90%, so that's really cool. Right now it costs about $1 to $5 to send a normal Monero transaction. So if you cut that much smaller, again, Monero is probably never going to be like the most efficient way to send money. I mean, think about it. I can Venmo you money for free, right? So hard to beat free, right? But it still makes it more reasonable. And then also faster verification time. So when you're scanning, like when you're syncing the wallet for the first time, this is where you're going to see the biggest benefit, where new transactions are verified faster. Second, we always want to improve privacy on Monero. So better on traceability. Currently, the ring size is 5, which we found like no practical evidence to believe that this is insufficient for the vast majority of transactions. There are certain edge use cases that I would love to talk about how there are certain circumstances you might want to consider sending money to yourself. But with the current ring size of 5 for every transaction is really good. But with something called RTRS ring CT, it could be increased to 32 with no performance or transaction size like loss or bloat. And it could be increased further with no real increase to transaction size, but then a degradation to verification time. So this is something the community is kind of reconciling with, but I would keep an eye on RTRS Ring CT as an upcoming development for this year, because it's something that's really important in terms of at least an option Monero has for improving privacy if we feel that there's evidence to support a larger ring size. Also, hardware wallets. This is super fun. So Monero is currently not supported on any hardware wallet. You can't use it with your Trezor, you can't use it with your Ledger, etc. Ledger just published yesterday. They did a pull request with the Monero repo with the changes they need in order to actually integrate it. So they've been working on Ledger integration for months so that Monero can work with it. So I'm really excited about that. I have a Ledger. I've been waiting, not very patiently, admittedly, because I want this so bad. But luckily, there's another project on the side. The Monero community actually crowdfunded its own hardware wallet. So this uses it will use completely open source software. The hardware itself uses very open and very liberally licensed components so that anyone can replicate this or recreate it, source the materials themselves, and know what's in it. And so this is just a really cool initiative. And luckily, the cost, too, would be pretty small. It's supposed to be finished, I believe, in the first half of this year. That's not for them to begin shipping anything or anything like that. But as far as having the design finished, should be happening in the first half of this year. So that's really cool to see that someone was like, "Hey, I can do this if you want me to," and the community was like, "Yes, that sounds great." And so here we have a hardware wallet that's pretty darn cool. Okay, side chains. Since Monero, Monero will always allow people to send money on the chain. It's always going to be the most secure and private way to send funds. But suppose that I am buying my coffee for $5 and I don't really, realistically, I'm not going to compromise the entire network and in order to just reverse this $5 transaction, right? If it's what I would call a low risk transaction. If you're sending $20 million, by all means, wait 5 minutes, right? But if you don't want to do that and want to have greater assurance, you can use something like a sidechain, and you can have greater efficiency and even perhaps some additional privacy or even other features on top of this. So an example would be the Lightning Network. This is often discussed with Bitcoin. Monero's approach so far has been, we just want to kind of support everything with sidechains. People will kind of choose whatever systems they want to use. There's no real reason to not support something because it doesn't impact the main chain itself. These are secondary systems that run alongside the main chain that allow for additional functionality. So the Lightning Network is much more efficient. It's less secure than an actual on-chain transaction, but it's faster, cheaper, and that's what many people prioritize. Other things might include Mimblewimble, if you've heard of them. That's a really efficient system that doesn't provide the same level of privacy as Monero, but it still provides a good enough privacy to protect against many circumstances, and it's very, very efficient, so that's really cool. Even ZK snarks, so what Zcash has, you could have that. We don't want a trusted system touching the actual chain itself, but if you want to run a trusted sidechain, by all means, there's nothing, no one's going to stop you. And similarly, you have Tumblebit, which is it's like CoinJoin with a mixer, but with different trust requirements. It's typically, I would say, better trust requirements. It's just a different way of mixing where it's harder for someone to get enough information to make sense of what they're tumbling. Sorry, I went a little deep there. But with the sidechains, that's something that with Monero you will start to see in the next few years. None of these are in development yet, really, but this is something that we will need to be conscious of in the Monero community because we want to make sure that everyone can use it and that transactions are small. And if everyone in the world is using Monero, it's not going to scale well on chain, even if our blocks get large enough, just because practically it's going to be difficult to maintain that infrastructure. So it's much easier to maintain these side chains, and so that's something that we're looking forward to for the efficiency advantages and stuff. Okay, so one thing that I've really noted, again, I said that I'm not a developer, and so I'm mostly a community member. I've noticed that the Monero community has really, really, really grown over the past several years. And I kind of joined here, when it was pretty darn small. I was basically the 1,000th subscriber on the Monero subreddit. And now we're up to over 90,000. And so it's been remarkable to see such a large increase, and it just seems to keep growing. And with that brings more talent, more people that are involved in discussions, and it's just great to have a lot of ideas and a lot of expertise bouncing ideas off each other. And so it's really fun to see that people are starting to use Monero because they kind of realize that it provides real advantages. It provides advantages that no centralized service can provide, which is atypical for most projects. And then one thing I want to leave you with, I suppose, never mind, not leave you quite yet. Still have a little bit more to go through. But to begin with, we know that most merchants don't accept Monero directly, just because they usually accept Bitcoin and then maybe Litecoin and then maybe Monero. And so this service called XMR.2 allows you to put in a Bitcoin address and how much Bitcoin you want to pay them, and then it will just tell you, hey, send this much Monero to this address, and then it will allow you to pay it privately. Of course, you can access the website with Tor, and then therefore your IP is protected. It's similar to Shapeshift. Shapeshift would provide similar functionality. This service has just been along for a long time, and the community has really enjoyed using it. Now, if you want to buy some other merchandise, you have a few other options. Late in December, they announced a partnership between Globy, which is a company that works with Monero, in order to allow other merchants to accept Monero directly. So some artists, such as Mariah Carey, directly accept Monero. So if you're looking for a use case and you want to buy Mariah Carey merchandise without other people knowing, there you go. You now can. Mission accomplished. That was literally the whole incentive for Monero, so you can do that. Yeah, so it's something we kind of want to get away from the image of people using Monero only for nefarious purposes, and I think we really are getting away from that. I was a little afraid a year ago when the community was really small, but now that the community has grown a lot, it's great to have a large community, and an advantage of having a large community is that people are much more likely to have legitimate use cases. So it's really cool, and we want people to be using Monero for real things like this. Okay, so I just want to have a quick comparison of privacy coins. So Monero, the real reason that I really support Monero, I'm not owned by Monero. I don't have any official title to Monero. I just follow Monero and contribute towards it because I feel like it fits my values the best. And if there's another coin that comes along that's better, by all means, I'm going to support that one. So with Monero, it is the only private system that offers mandatory privacy and in order to actually provide those fungibility benefits, and also does it without incorporating trust in the system. So you don't have to trust someone or be reliant on them to keep your privacy safe. You know that the network itself is doing that. And that is actually very, very rare for anything to actually provide all those benefits. So the one I want to spend most of the time talking about today is Zcash, because I don't necessarily think it's a good coin, but the technology behind it is definitely worth talking about. This is with the zero-knowledge proofs. So with Zcash, you have two different types of addresses, and you can make different types of transactions. So you have a completely transparent way that's exactly the same as Bitcoin. That's literally over here. It's exactly the same as Bitcoin. You can see the sender, receiver, and amount. 90% of transactions use this. The ones that are really cool, though, are the fully shielded. This is where the sender, receiver, and amount are all hidden. And theoretically, this could provide greater advantages than Monero because it could better protect the sender with ring signatures, and it's 1 in n for the total number of ring size. With ZK snarks, it's 1 in the entire pool of all of the possible zero-knowledge outputs, which is pretty good. The problem is that very few outputs are actually zero knowledge. And when you interact with people in the Zcash network, when there are connections between the zero-knowledge world and the transparent world, there's a lot of information that's leaked, such as the transaction amount and a lot of other information. And so you can see use of these systems is still very low because it's not mandatory and it's hard to use right now. Luckily, they're making advances to make it easier to use, and I hope that they make it mandatory. But ultimately, they still have trust in the system. You don't need to trust Zcash for privacy, which is good, but you do need to trust that the currency has any value whatsoever, because they can print any coins at any time with colluding in the trusted setup. And so that's just something that I think disqualifies it from a fundamental value of really good money, because ultimately we're just trying to make good money. If you have money where you're not sure that the coins will be worth anything at any point in time, I don't think that's really a good value. And I'm not talking like the day's price. I'm talking literally any value at all. But it's still really cool. The issue, though, is that when people transact with the transparent system, they're leaking a lot of information, even if they use the private system. And they saw with a zero-link paper, a recent research paper that came out, that a third of transactions that touch this private pool at all can be de-anonymized with very strong evidence because people don't know how to use it properly. And so that's really important, is that this is a consequence of not being mandatory privacy. You could have theoretical setups, but if there's a way for people not to know how to use it properly, use it incorrectly, if you send funds to someone and then they don't use it properly, it just makes the answer of does this provide good privacy really, really, really complicated, because it's hard to provide a really good answer to that question. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. The official website is getmonero.org. The subreddit is rmonero. Most of the discussions are there, so I highly encourage you to go on there. We have a Stack Exchange for Monero where I'm a large contributor, and there are a lot of really good answers there if you have some technical questions. That is really the place to go. And then if you need to contact me for some reason, my email address is there at the bottom. So thanks so much for all your time. Do you want to do questions now, or do you want to speak again? What's the rest of the agenda? Okay, does anyone have any questions real quick? Yeah.
So I read on the Monero subreddit that Monero does periodic hard forks twice a year. Can you explain a little more about that?
Yeah, so for those who are unfamiliar with hard forks, you can think of them as like protocol upgrades, where you get everyone to agree on a new set of network rules. With Monero, we acknowledge as a community that the coin is not done yet. It's still a work in progress. And we feel like it would be detrimental for the coin to just be locked up in the status quo. For instance, if Monero is locked up in the status quo now without any of the efficiency advantages, and people really start using it, it will make the network very difficult to maintain. And so it's important to have these common upgrades. So with the community, there's a lot of focus and a lot of support for twice a year hard forks. And so these typically happen one in the spring, one in the late summer, and around September. Sometimes there's more. Last year there were 3. And that's just something in the Monero community that we feel that it's important to be able to be open to these ideas. And we've had several in the past. And so typically we'll have some plan. I think some certain items that the protocol will actually upgrade. In the past, it's usually been increasing the ring size or adding ring CT or something like that. For future upgrades, it likely will include increasing the ring size, several other changes.
So then, as a user, what do I need to do, and is there any risk of me losing my Monero?
Okay. The good thing is there's no risk of losing your Monero. So you don't need to. If you don't do anything, you still have your Monero. The issue is you just need to download a new wallet, basically. So you just need to update your software, and then it'll work same as it did before, and then better, assuming the upgrades are beneficial.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah.
So you talked about 100% encryption versus just 1% or 10%. So let's just take an analogy. If I ride my bicycle and 90% of the people don't lock their bikes, and 10% of the people lock their bikes, isn't it better for the 10% who lock their bikes because the thieves can go after the ones who don't lock it?
I think that's a very short-sighted argument. Just because you're committing, so it's not. With that example, it would be as if you left your bike somewhere with a lock for eternity, right? Because someone still has access to all the information on the blockchain. So sure, there may be other bikes there that aren't locked, that are easier to choose, but people have the rest of history to check out your bike anyway. So sure, it might make other ones easier to look at, but realistically the cost is trivial to look at any of these items on the blockchain. So if someone's just driving around picking up bikes, to go to your example, it's typically better if you have a system where everyone has some sort of protection, because then it makes it very hard for someone to actually have a wide-scale surveillance or collection agency, right? Because it's hard. Yeah, in the back.
Just on that analogy,
obviously we're not talking about likes here, but it's not really like a security thing, I would think, that we're having an issue with. It would be a linkability. So, like, what am I trying to say? If 90% are, you can link them easily because they're not hidden. The 10% stick out, and you can almost like put the pieces together like a puzzle, potentially.
Yeah, like if there's theoretically like 2 people using a private transaction, it's not like a private system. Like if I tried to make my own Tor for some reason, and like only like 3 people used it, it's not very private, right? And so it's important to just increase the number of users as much as possible so that you have those protections as best as you can provide. Yeah.
So I think a common concern is that maybe a second layer solution to Bitcoin could get Bitcoin more anonymous and reduce relevancy of Monero. And the argument I hear mostly from Monero is that, well, you know, the main chain in Bitcoin is transparent, so you can see the coins that go into that second layer solution, and as a result, everything in that second layer solution will be blacklisted and destroyed. But if, number one, I guess, do you agree with that, or what's your take on that? And if it is true, why would that be any different than Monero as a whole getting blacklisted by the same entities who would want to take any Bitcoin second layer solution?
Yeah, I think in most cases, assuming the user pool of these private systems is large, typically the concern isn't blacklisting, it's issues with de-anonymization. But I think that this is not a threat to Monero. Reason being, you already have systems now where they're transparent and then they have a privacy system on top of it. Zcash, for example, you have a transparent system and then you have a theoretically perfect privacy system on top of it, right? But no one uses it. And as such, you can still trace pretty much everything that happens in Zcash. And so people always are like, oh, how does Ethereum add in ZK snarks? Because they've mentioned they want to add ZK snarks. I don't think it will impact Monero at all. I think it will impact Zcash. I don't think it will impact Monero. If Bitcoin or Litecoin or someone introduces confidential transactions and several other improvements, if they're optional, I don't think it'll really matter because the vast majority of the time, the exchanges will choose whatever is the most efficient, whatever is the cheapest, and that typically doesn't mean privacy because they don't really care.
So I agree that if something is optional, like people don't always use it, but like using Monero itself is optional too.
Right.
So you're saying that the user base for these optional second layer solutions, you anticipate will just be smaller than the user base for Monero?
So I think the important difference, if Monero was only used as like a mixing service for Bitcoin, right? You take your Bitcoin, you convert to Monero, you send a few transactions, you go back to Bitcoin. It wouldn't be better than like a ZK snark or second layer. The difference though is that you can directly spend with Monero, you can directly interact exclusively within Monero. And since there is a large enough network effect behind that, I think that there's enough options for opportunities for people to get involved, get on and off the system, that I think is much greater than a second layer solution. Now granted, if Ethereum adds ZK snarks and like suppose 90% of people actually use ZK snarks on Ethereum, which would be great because that means that people actually care about privacy, have some priority of it. I still think it would be better to have the privacy system. It still is better to have the privacy system as the settling layer, but at least then you would have potentially more users using like Ethereum ZK snarks than Monero totally. And so that's just something you need to grapple with. If Monero is really small, if like 10 people use Monero, it's better to use ZK snarks on Ethereum, right? So it's kind of, the answer changes all the time, but since I think Monero is pretty large now, that I feel comfortable saying that you still have the greatest level of protection using Monero. Yeah.
So I kind of will change the, are you familiar with quantum resistance? It seems that Monero will be quantum resistant, but I'm not 100% sure because obviously I don't know the insights.
Right. So that's something the Monero Research Lab has been really focused on. You can see some of their updates, what their thoughts are in more detail related to this, but I can say that the Monero Research Lab has gone through the code that Monero has and has done like a basic risk assessment over how likely this would be compromised given certain quantum computing capabilities. And the issue is that those given capabilities aren't given.
Essentially, they can discover the private key based on the public. That's the
Right.
attack. So Bitcoin will not be able, like that. It's not resistant. Most of the currencies will not be resistant to that.
Yeah. So with Monero, there's definitely still some concern that certain items will have weak protections against some of these theoretical quantum computing items. And luckily, Monero is not alone in that challenge. And so that's something that we'll have to address as quantum computing becomes closer towards actually coming into fruition. So that's something that's definitely on some people's minds.
I think if a quantum computer attack happens, it just is a privacy concern and not like your funds aren't at risk. Is that right, or do you know?
So theoretically, if you were to break like public-private key cryptography, which is well beyond just Monero, it would potentially provide some issues to security, from my understanding. But that clearly, like, you would literally, the math that Monero uses to provide those systems is what banking systems, governments, and pretty much everything uses. It's kind of the staple of security. And so from my understanding, again, I'm not a cryptographer, so I highly encourage you to look at what the actual words of Monero Research Lab says. But in my understanding, that's still something that that should still be looked at. But Monero is not alone in. And so it's unlikely, like, yeah, it's unlikely that Monero would be the scope for which someone would, if someone theoretically had a capability that we don't even know what the capability is, and was able to use that sort of exploit, it's unlikely they would use like it on Monero first. But that's something we're getting into the theoretical world, so it's hard to say because we don't really know what any of these assumptions are. Yeah, sorry for the weird answer there.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of benefits to like traceability of transactions and money, right? Like for governments to track criminal activity, for example. So I guess like, let's say Monero like magically scales so that everyone, you know, is using Monero all over the world, right? Like, how do you see like sort of regulatory surveillance developing so that we still have the ability to trace criminal activity? And I mean, yeah, I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the question was related to government regulation and how we could still prevent things like money laundering, issues like that.
Yeah,
and so,
how does like decentralized activity?
Yeah, and I think that the monitoring systems will be similar to how you would use cash. So you would still have KYC AML on all the exchanges, on most on and off ramps. So as people get into the system, they would still have some check. If people are working with employers and receiving payment, they would still submit W-2s. The government would still receive how much everyone makes in that information. If you make a transaction, all legally abiding businesses will still charge sales tax. If I report $0 as income to the IRS and then a day later buy a Ferrari, I'm still going to be audited by the IRS, right? So I still think that I think that those concerns are typically overrepresented because we have had, until recently, a system where the money was private by default, where the government didn't know everything to begin with. And they were still able to raise revenues, taxes, etc. And so I think that realistically, for people to maintain licenses, for businesses to operate legitimately, for people to not get audited, or if they are audited to be safe, they will still follow the legal restrictions that are in place. And so many of those are in place to prevent things like money laundering or make it harder. And so I don't see any of that changing. So
we have time maybe for one more question. We're actually 15 minutes over our allotted time, but we've extended the bar for another, it was a half an hour. So we have 15 minutes after one more question for another drink. So with that, are there any questions?
Last one, anyone? Or just, you heard bar and you're ready to go. Okay, I don't blame you. Okay, thanks again for your time. I'd love to talk to you after. Take care.